thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to meet Anne in person. We were extremely excited in the United States to see her on video, so forthright, what you would expect from a politician who had their eyes open, but we get from so few. So she is very a courageous person. And I'm honored to be again with Dr. Andrew Harms. I risked nothing by coming out against fluoridation. I was a full tenured professor at St. Lawrence University. There was not much they could do with me. But with Andrew Harms, still a professional dentist, there was a lot the dental community could do to Andrew when he came out against fluoridation. And as former president of the South Australian Dental Association, that was a dramatic thing to do, and a lot of Australians have benefited from that. And I'm also thrilled to be here with Daniel, and because Daniel and Jaya represent the younger generation, and I think it's going to be more difficult to fool the younger generation with this nonsense than perhaps some of the older people that have grown up with this, unquestionably. Young people are just astounded when they hear this information. And by the way, we are not talking about science here, we're talking about a religion. It's so difficult to persuade people who believe something. Try it. You can't change a belief system. The dentists have been brought up believing that fluoridation works. The health departments and the officials, the bureaucrats who work for these health departments, when they were at medical school, I was going to say mental school, when they were at medical school, they were taught to believe in this system. And not only do they believe in this system, they believe that the people opposed to fluoridation are a bunch of crazies, a bunch of wackos. And that's the way they support themselves. On the one hand, they'll give you a long list of endorsements of organizations that support fluoridation, hide behind their skirts, offer no science to support their position, just endorsements, and on the other hand, denigrate any opponent of fluoridation as a bunch of crazy people you don't have to listen to. Very convenient, extremely convenient. Well, I'm a scientist. I've studied this issue for 14 years, and with two other scientists, a biologist from Scotland, got his PhD from Oxford, Spenny Micklem, and James Beck, who's got an MD and a PhD from Calgary, and Jim has just had an amazing victory. Calgary City Council voted 10-3 to stop fluoridation. That's 1.1 million people. That was just a few days ago. We have a councillor introducing a bill to remove it from New York City. A lot of things are happening in North America right now, and hopefully Australia will join them. I'm hoping that Perth will follow Calgary, where it was just a couple of days ago. Anyway, the book is out. Here it is. You can order it on Amazon.com. I'm not sure about the postage, but anyway, hopefully you can get it. So the outline of my talk, gosh, I'm going to have to get it to see. It's a poor medical practice. It's the evidence of any benefit is very weak. This comes as a surprise to many people. There is no adequate margin of safety from known health effects. Let's get that out straight away. There is no question that fluoride is extremely toxic, and fluoride has damaged the health of millions of people. Fluoride. The issue is there an adequate margin of safety between the levels which have caused harm to millions of people in India, China, parts of Africa, Mexico, and so on, and the doses that we are going to get in a fluoridated community. That is the central argument that has to be resolved. And I will argue that there is no adequate margin of safety between the known harmful effects of fluoride and the doses that we're going to get in fluoridated communities. And lastly, I'm going to argue that the promotion of fluoridation has been totally unprofessional and unscientific. So, it's a poor medical practice. It's the only time that we've added, since 1945, that we've added a substance, a medicine, to the public water supply. And for obvious reasons. It deprives individuals from their right to informed consent to medication. We're allowing governments, we're allowing councils, we're allowing states to do to everyone what a doctor can do to no one. A doctor cannot force you to take a medicine against your will. But that's what's happening here. And don't say you have a choice about drinking water, because some people do not have a choice because their income levels are such that they cannot afford bottled water, reverse osmosis. You can control the concentration of the waterworks, but you can't control the dose. Ask any, because you can't control how much water people drink. You can't control the amount of fluoride they get from other sources. Ask any pharmacist if there's any drug that he can say to people, you don't have to worry about the dose. That's absolute nonsense. No way. Secondly, you can't control who gets the medicine. Ask the pharmacist if there's a drug in his pharmacy that he can give to young children, babies, elderly people, sick people, people who have poor nutrition. Is there one drug he can give to everybody without even having to worry? No, no way. Nonsense. There is no individual oversight by a doctor, but normally when a doctor writes a prescription for a medication, the understanding is if they experience any health effects, any side effects, they come back to the doctor and say, Doc, that stuff you gave me, I'm getting these pains in my knee, I'm getting headaches, I'm getting nauseous. And the doctor will change the medication or lower the dose. But we don't allow for that because the doctors are not trained to even recognize any symptoms of fluoride toxicity. So there's no individual oversight and there's no health agency monitoring side effects. There have been no studies in Australia, no health studies. The arrogance of your health organizations in every single state who force this on people have never ever bothered to track health effects of fluoridated communities in Australia. They know absolutely nothing. Nothing. Everything that comes out of the mouths of Australian health authorities are totally second-hand. And that, of course, includes South Australia. No health studies have been conducted in Australia. The only studies that get conducted in Australia are on teeth, and teeth, as the teeth were the only tissue in the body. It's outrageous, it's irresponsible, and then, with no knowledge, to have the arrogance to force this on people is utterly, utterly insane, unacceptable. The fluoride is a known toxic substance that interferes with many fundamental biochemical functions. In fact, the first opponents of fluoridation in the US were biochemists who had used fluoride to inhibit enzymes. People that won Nobel Prizes like James Sumner at Cornell University, the world's leading enzyme chemists, said, don't put fluoride in the water, it poisons enzymes. Now we know it interferes with G proteins, which is a system for getting messages across membranes, which impacts every cell in the body. The level used in fluoridation is not small. In America, they like to say, oh, 1 part per million is so teeny, weeny, couldn't possibly hurt you. 1 part per million is 1 inch in 16 miles. It's 1 cent in $10,000. Absolute nonsense. I mean, the numbers are correct, but the notion that by making fun of how small 1 in a million is ridiculous unless you tie it to the toxicity of the substance in question. In fact, 1 in a million, 1 part per million, is 100 times the safe drinking water standard for arsenic. It's 1,000,000 times too much if we were talking about dioxin. So we must know something about fluoride before we say whether 1 part per million is large or small. And there is something that nature has done which allows us a good comparison. The level in mother's milk is as low as 0.004 parts per million. Now let's see whether 1 part per million is small enough. It's 250 times higher than what nature put into baby's first meal. This means a woman, a parent that is bottle feeding their baby in Adelaide, and Perth for that matter, in Adelaide, is giving that baby 250 times more fluoride than a breastfed baby in Adelaide. And parents are not being given any warning about this at all. Fluoridation should never have started in 1945, but there are many times it should have stopped. And one of the times it should have stopped is when the Center for Disease Control, which is the part of the US Public Health Service, which is now part of the Department of Health and Human Services, which promotes fluoridation avidly, aggressively, admitted that the major benefits of fluoride are topical. It works on the outside of the tooth, not from inside the body. The moment they admitted that, it makes nonsense of swallowing fluoride. It makes utter nonsense of putting it in the drinking water. And here are the two statements. 1999, its actions primarily are topical for both adults and children. 1999. 2001, fluoride's predominant effect is post-eruptive, that's after the teeth have erupted, and topical. As this Arvid Carlson said, in pharmacology, if the effect is topical, it's awkward to use it in any other way than as a local treatment. I mean, this is obvious. You have the teeth there, they're available for you, why drink the stuff? And fluoridated toothpaste is universally available, so if you want to put fluoride on the surface of the teeth, it's easy to do, brush it on, but spit it out. The chemicals used are not pharmaceutical grade, as Anne pointed out at the beginning, as used in dental products. They come from the wet scrubbing system of the phosphate fertilizer industry. And the irony in the United States is probably the same in Australia. We can't dump this stuff into the sea by international law. We can't dump it locally because it's far too concentrated. But if someone in the United States purchases a product, purchases a substance, even if it's a hazardous waste, the moment it is purchased by somebody, it's now become a product, and it's no longer covered by hazardous waste regulations. So it's irony. So when the public water companies purchase this substance, it suddenly switches from being a hazardous waste to a product, and then they have this, they're allowed to put it in our drinking water. Absolutely preposterous. If Monty Python had written this sketch, nobody would believe it. They'd have a good laugh, but no one would believe it was reality, but it is reality. The main chemicals used are the silicon fluorides, hexafluorosilicic acid, or sodium salt, neither of which these chemicals occur naturally. They're man-made products, and they've never been subjected to rigorous toxicological testing. The US Food and Drug Administration, which normally regulates any drug that we are supposed to swallow, has never regulated fluoride. Either the fluoride that we add to the water or the fluoride that you get in prescription tablets. It remains, as according to the FDA, as an unapproved drug. That's its official classification in the United States. It's an unapproved drug. But we give this unapproved drug to over 180 million Americans every day in their drinking water. It's never, and as a result, as the FDA has never regulated fluoride for ingestion, it's never been subjected to the randomized clinical trials. So for effectiveness, so after over 60 years, this substance, which is supposed to reduce tooth decay, has never gone through the rigorous gold standard for proof of efficacy, namely a double-blind, randomized controlled trial. Ironically, the FDA does regulate toothpaste. And if you look at the tube of toothpaste in the United States, first of all, you're told the drug facts. Then you're told do not swallow. Then you're told only use a pea-sized amount. And then that's what a pea-sized amount looks like if you didn't know what a pea was. And this is the FDA's required warning. This is what the FDA requires in every tube of toothpaste, fluoridated toothpaste. Keep out of reach of children under 6 years of age. If more than used for brushing is accidentally swallowed, get medical help or contact a poison control center right away. Now, what is interesting then is to work out how much fluoride there is in a pea-sized amount of toothpaste. And it is easy to do. It's actually 1/4 milligram. Now let's compare to fluoridated water. We fluoridate at 1 part per million. That's 1 milligram per liter. So 1/4 milligram is going to be in 1/4 liter, or 250 milliliters. 1 glass of water. Come in, Monty Python, and tell us what the FDA then, if they were, somebody said to the FDA, well, you've got this regulation on toothpaste, what about giving us the regulation on water fluoridation? Over every tap, you'd have to have this warning. Do not swallow this water. Make sure that no child under 6 uses this water, swallows this water. And if you should accidentally swallow 1 glass, get medical help or contact a poison center right away. Okay, so what about, everybody assumes that there may be dangers in this thing, and it may be a daft policy and an unethical policy because you're forcing it on people against their will. But surely it works. I mean, they wouldn't do this, would they, if it didn't reduce tooth decay? Well, does it? If we compare countries, first thing to note is that most countries don't fluoridate their water. There's only about 30 countries in the world that have some water fluoridation, and only 8 countries in the world that have more than 50%. Australia is at the top of the table. Australia, Colombia, Ireland, Israel, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the United States all have more than 50% of their populations drinking fluoridated water. 98% of Western Europe now drinks non-fluoridated water. Now, I've seen statements from Australian officials. They say, oh, well, this is because Europe has very primitive water supplies systems, so they couldn't do it for practical reasons. Absolute nonsense. Tell Germany and Scandinavia that they have an unsophisticated water delivery system. That is a pure fabrication. The second thing they say is, oh, well, they have other means of getting fluoride. They fluoridate their salt. Well, true. There are 4 countries in Europe, Austria, France, Germany, and Switzerland, who fluoridate their salt. The majority of Europe does not fluoridate its water, nor fluoridate its salt. Of course, they all have fluoridated toothpaste available. Look at the rate of tooth decay. This is tooth decay in 12-year-olds, based upon data collected by the World Health Organization in each of these countries. And you'll see that tooth decay in 12-year-olds has been coming down from the 1960s through to the present in all these countries. This is tooth decay in 12-year-olds. All coming down. And 4 of those countries are fluoridated, and about 14 are not fluoridated. And I defy you to see any difference. If you look at the rates of tooth decay today, it's a wash. You cannot say that tooth decay in fluoridated countries is better than the tooth decay in non-fluoridated countries. If you compare the states, this is the US states in order of the percentage of population drinking fluoridated water. Now they had a survey, 2002 to 2004, where they issued a questionnaire to parents in all 50 states. This is the Department of Health and Human Services. And one of the questions was, does your child have very good or excellent teeth? And here's the answer, yes. Here's the answer, yes. Yes, my child has very good or excellent teeth. Now, it's a noisy line, but there's no relationship between those answers and the percentage of the population in the state that's drinking fluoridated water. Now, if that was actually for families of low income, if we look at the response, yes, from families of high income, you see there's very little noise. It's about 80% across the board. Again, totally flat and no relationship whatsoever to the percentage of the population drinking fluoridated water. So there is no obvious relationship between good teeth and fluoridated water, but you can see that there is a relationship, a very strong relationship, and that is with income levels. And that tells you, if you don't carefully control for income levels in any comparison between 2 cities or several cities, then you can get absolutely erroneous results. And this is what's happened again and again in Australia. They picked out 2 towns or 2 states and compared them without controlling for income levels, and quite frankly, you can get any result that you want. It's sloppy science, it's politics. Now, the National Institute of Dental Research, which was formed in 1948 on the backs of the fluoridation research program, very pro-fluoride, and there were a number of studies coming out, including an important one from Mark Diesendorf from Australia, who published an article in Nature in 1986, and Mark showed that there was no difference in tooth decay between fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities in Australia, around the world. And he showed also that tooth decay was coming down before fluoridation was introduced in parts of Australia, and it continued to go down even after the benefits would have been maximized. And there were a number of studies that came out in the 80s along similar lines. And it prompted the National Institute of Dental Research to do a massive survey which cost the taxpayers in the United States nearly $4 million. They looked at tooth decay in 39,000 children in 84 communities. And when John Yamiyanis used the Freedom of Information Act to get the data out of them, he found there was no significant difference between decayed, missing and filled teeth, tooth decay, comparing children who'd always lived their lives in a fluoridated community, that's the black diamond, children that lived all their lives in a non-fluoridated community, that's the black square, and the open square, the children who lived some of their time in one or the other. No statistical difference. Largest survey done in the United States. But John Yamiyanis was anti-fluoridation, so he can chuck all that away. That can't possibly be scientifically. We can only trust the scientists who work for government to come out with the thing. Well, they did. Brunel and Carlos, who worked for the NIDR, using the same database, did something and came out with results. They jacked up the sensitivity of the study by reporting not decayed, missing and filled teeth, but decayed, missing and filled surfaces. There are about 4 or 5 surfaces to each tooth. There's 4 surfaces to the top cutting teeth, these sharp ones, and 4 for the bottom 6 cutting teeth, but all the rest 5 surfaces. Overall, somewhere there between 4 and 5 surfaces per tooth. So if you compare DMFT to DMFS, this is up to 5 times more sensitive. What did they find? The average for 5 to 17-year-olds, for children who lived all their lives in a non-fluoridated community, was 3.54 decayed, missing and filled surfaces. And for children who always lived in a fluoridated community, 2.8. So the difference, the magnificent difference between the two, is 0.6 of a tooth surface. Remember, there's 5 tooth surfaces to a mouth. Now, that's what we got. That's the best we have done in the United States to find a difference of 0.6 of one tooth surface. This is the average for 5 to 17-year-old, the average difference if you've lived all your life in a fluoridated versus a non-fluoridated community. Bear that in mind when we're talking about various health effects, about bone fractures, brain damage, lower thyroid function, accumulation in the pineal gland. Remember that we are doing this officially in order to have an average saving of 0.6 of one tooth surface. In other words, one filling. All of these risks are going to be taken officially for one filling. That's the best they've done. Now, what kind of risk would you take to save 0.6 of one tooth filling? However, before you take this as gospel, you've got to remember that Brunel and Carlos did not report statistics for this. They just left it as a finding of numbers with no statistical treatment. So we don't even know whether this 0.6 is an actually statistically significant result, which is an extraordinary thing for a major government entity to miss out statistics. The second thing is, nor did they adjust for possible delayed eruption of teeth in fluoridated areas. There is some evidence that fluoride delays the eruption of the teeth. And a colleague, a friend of mine from Texas, made an adjustment. Here is the unadjusted figure. This is that 0.6 saving, that saving in tooth decay from age of 5 across to 17. That's reported by Brunel and Carlos. Now, if you assume a 1-year delay in tooth eruption, then the two curves overlap and the difference disappears. So if there is any delay in tooth eruption, these small differences are evaporated. Now, in Australia, you found even less savings. Spencer and co-workers who's from Adelaide here, funded by Colgate, found a saving in 2 states of only 0.1 to 0.3, 1/4 to 1/2 of the American finding. And in this paper of his, in the introduction, Spencer actually offers this. He says some words to the effect. There has been recently some criticism of the fluoridation program on the basis of that it isn't very effective and there may be some health problems. He acknowledged that there was criticism of the fluoridation program. However, and he offers this, that it really does work. 0.12 to 0.3 tooth surfaces. And then Armfield and Spencer in 2004, again from your local university here, found no statistically significant difference in permanent tooth decay. They found some difference in primary teeth. Permanent tooth with children in South Australia who drank fluoridated water all their lives and those who drank bottled or tap water. And again you get this complete disconnect between the science that they're reporting and the politics of what they have to do to serve their taskmasters, the people that pay their bills, either the government or industry, in the case of Colgate. Because having shown in this study there's no statistical difference between children who live all their lives drinking fluoridated tap water or bottled water or tank water, they then advocated the addition of fluoride to bottled water. Someone must have got to them and said, hey, you've got to do something about this report, this study. I was in Australia when Spencer went on ABC radio and said we should be adding fluoride to bottled water. This is David Locker. He died last year, sadly. The magnitude of fluoridation's effect is not large in absolute terms, is often not statistically significant, and may not be of clinical significance. He too supported water fluoridation. There's something driving this which is remote from science. And then there's a very important report from Comerac from Europe, I think it's from Denmark, large European study. They controlled for delayed eruption of the teeth and again found no difference. Once you control the eruption of the teeth, there was no difference. And another study from Warren, part of the Iowa study, millions of dollars of taxpayers' money have gone into this Iowa study. And there they measured tooth decay as a function of individual exposure, not living in a fluoridated or non-fluoridated community, but calculating how much fluoride these kids were getting on a daily basis. And they found no relationship between how much fluoride was being swallowed and tooth decay. Again, these people support fluoridation. Again, this disconnect between the science they're actually reporting and the political agenda that they feel obliged to support. Modern studies show that when communities stop fluoridation for one reason or another, tooth decay does not go up. So when the two Germanys combined, East Germany was fluoridated, West Germany wasn't. When they combined, East Germany stopped. When they looked at the tooth decay, it didn't suddenly get worse. It actually got better. In Cuba, same thing. In Canada, in British Columbia, same thing. And in Finland. And all those studies, by the way, were conducted by people that are pro-fluoridation. There is no adequate margin of safety to protect everyone from known harmful effects of fluoride. This was a very important document here. This is the National Research Council review that was published in March of 2006. They looked at fluoride in drinking water, a scientific review of EPA's standards. So the EPA asked the National Research Council, part of the National Academies in the United States, to review these safety of fluoride. 507 pages, 1,100 references. Took them over 3 years to do. And for the first time in American history, the panel had both sides on it. They didn't just hand-pick the pro-fluoridation people, which is what they normally do. That's what the National Health and Medical Research Council does on a routine basis. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a government agency. They do these government reviews to support government policy, but that's another story. In this case, they had people on this panel that were pro-fluoridation, people on this panel that were anti-fluoridation, and the majority who had never taken a position on fluoridation. But what they came back with is they said the EPA's so-called safe drinking water standard is not safe, it's not protective against severe dental fluorosis, and it's not protective against bone fractures, and you need to come up with a new MCLG. And we're still waiting for the EPA to do that after nearly 5 years. What they did show, though, the harmful effects of fluoride. It causes dental fluorosis, it causes brain damage, it lowers thyroid function, it accumulates in the human pineal gland, it causes bone damage, it may cause a cancer called osteosarcoma, a bone cancer. And some people may be very sensitive to very low levels of fluoride. All these issues are addressed in their book. Now, let's look at dental fluorosis, because there's no argument about this one. The early promoters of fluoridation thought that at 1 part per million fluoride, they could limit dental fluorosis to just 10% of the children in its very mild form. Whoops! When they looked at the same review in 86, 87, this is the same one that I've talked about already, they found that 29.9%, nearly 1 in 3 children living in a fluoridated community in the United States had dental fluorosis. 3 times as much as they anticipated, and also it wasn't just restricted to very mild. That is the one. Remember, they wanted 10%, expected 10% very mild. But they also had 5.8% in mild and 1.3% in moderate. And the words are a little deceptive, very mild, mild, and moderate. And Andrew can reinforce this, but I'll show you some pictures. There's very mild. This impacts up to 25% of the tooth surface with opaque patches, which begin as white but can go yellow, brown, or orange-brown. And mild, note this, mild, up to 50% of the tooth surface is impacted. And moderate, notice, moderate, 100% of the tooth surface impacted. And the latest figures from the CDC, this is just a few weeks ago, indicating that these figures have now gone up, that 41% of all American children, not just those that live in fluoridated communities, 41% of all American children have dental fluorosis. 28.5% very mild, 8.6% mild, and 3.6% either moderate or severe. They didn't separate those two categories. And that's what's prompted recent events in the United States. It has prompted, 41% of our kids now, 41%. And as you can probably guess, this isn't just from fluoridated water. This is because we've got so many other sources of fluoride today. We have pesticides, we have fumigants, which leave fluoride deposits. We have fluoride in fertilizers, which ends up in our fruit and vegetables. We have fluoride pollution, and we have fluoride in dental products. All of these sources are growing, and with it, this dental fluorosis. Now, one of the things which happened after this report, because they made it clear in here that even at 1 part per million, children, bottle-fed children, were getting too much fluoride. Bottle-fed children were getting too much fluoride, according to this. And after that, the ADA, the American Dental Association, issued this recommendation to its membership, the dentists in America. It says, if using a product that needs to be reconstituted, baby formula, solid baby formula, parents and caregivers should consider using water that has no or low levels of fluoride. Now, there's one problem with this. They gave that message to their dentists, but they didn't give it to parents. Parents are not being warned about this. So this dental community now knows that if kids less than 1 year of age get fluoride, this is the most sensitive year for developing dental fluorosis. But parents are not being told this. And so one of the very least that we could hope would come out of South Australia, I hope you can get rid of this stupid practice completely, immediately. And I hope that Anne will pioneer that. But if she can't do that, at least the very reasonable step is to require in South Australia the warning to be put into people's water bills. Parents should not use tap water to make up baby formula. And notice if we're advocating something that they don't agree with, they agree with it. The difference is that we agree with them that they should, not only because it causes dental fluorosis, but we're worried about other health effects. So that's one difference. Another difference is we want to get this warning to parents. They're only prepared to get this warning to dentists. In January the 7th of this year, the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the overall federal health agency, announced lowering of optimal level from the range of 0.7 to 1.2 to 0.7 because of these concerns about dental fluorosis. That 41% of American children now have some form of dental fluorosis. And what I think some of you read about that in Australia, because it went around the world. But on January the 10th, the EPA Pesticide Division announced a phase out of the use of fumigant, the fumigant sulfuryl fluoride, on food because the exposure to fluoride is already too high. This was a huge victory to us. We precipitated this action because we threatened legal action. We have been working on this for 8 years. The Fluoride Action Network has been working for 8 years to stop Dow AgroSciences using this fumigant. In Australia, you're still using this fumigant. You're like everything else. You listen to America when it suits your purposes, but when it doesn't suit your purposes, you don't listen to America. Again, that's the behavior of a religion, not a science. When fluoride is damaging the baby, this is the key question from our perspective, and I suspect from many of yours. When fluoride is damaging the baby's growing tooth cells, causing dental fluorosis, what is it doing to its other developing tissues? Now, I'm concerned about the brain, because at birth, the baby's blood-brain barrier is not fully developed. And this is not the time, in my view, that the baby should be subjected to 250 times more fluoride than that baby would get from mother's milk. And then this is what Arvid Carlsson, by the way, Arvid Carlsson led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden. He says, one wonders what an increase in exposure to fluoride, such as occurs in bottle-fed infants, may mean for the development of the brain and the other organs. That was in 1978. Then in 2006, this National Research Council, it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with functions of the brain. And we now have over 100 animal experiments which show that fluoride can damage the brain. This is one of them. Barnett and co-workers gave rats 1 part per million fluoride in their drinking water for 1 year in 2 different forms. One group got aluminum fluoride, the other group got sodium fluoride, and of course there was a control. 3 groups of animals. Both the exposed groups had kidney damage, brain damage, greater uptake of aluminium into the brain, and beta amyloid deposits, which are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. So this is only just one animal study now, but it's interesting that fluoride may be damaging our citizens at both ends of the age range, and possibly for the same reason, that at birth the blood-brain barrier is not functioning 100%, and maybe as we get older, it's possible, or in this case, in these rats, as they get older, maybe that blood-brain barrier again becomes more permeable and fluoride gets in. But it's worrying that fluoride may actually be facilitating the transport of aluminium into the brain. So it's the combination of fluoride and aluminum that may be a problem here. No one's bothered to reproduce that study. There are now 24 published studies from China, India, Iran, and Mexico indicating an association with moderate to high natural levels of fluoride and lowered IQ in children. And you can get a whole list of the studies from our webpage and from our book. Now, Zhang, I was particularly interested in this study, and eventually went to China and went to the 2 villages where this study was done. One village had less than 0.7 parts per million of fluoride in their well water, and the other village had between 2.5 and 4.5 parts per million of fluoride in their water. And otherwise, the villages looked more or less the same. I mean, you had the same housing, the same occupation, they were all rural farmers, same diet, same lifestyles, same educational levels, and so on. Everything looked the same except for the fluoride in their drinking water. And they also controlled for the lead in the drinking water. There was no difference. And they also controlled for iodine intake. Both lead and iodine can interfere with IQ. But they found overall a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points difference comparing these two villages. And Zhang went on to estimate that from linear extrapolation of all the data, that the IQ would be lowered at 1.9 parts per million. That's when it would start. Now, I would argue then, if fluoride is associated with the lowering of IQ of children at 1.9 parts per million in a small population, there are about 300 children in that village. So now if you're a regulator, you say, well, we've seen a harmful effect at 1.9 parts per million, and our job is to protect all the children in Australia, or all the children in the United States. You have to apply a margin of safety. You have to assume that across a whole population, there's likely to be at least a 10-fold difference in sensitivity in those children. That some children will be very sensitive, some children will be very resistant to any toxic substance, including fluoride. So clearly there's no adequate margin of safety. We normally, as I say, use a factor of 10. It's difficult. We're working from concentration. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that those kids are drinking 1 litre of water a day. So this effect is taking place then at 1.9 milligrams per day. Okay? We're assuming they're drinking 1 litre of water, 1.9 milligrams. Apply your normal safety factor of 10. And we would say then to protect the children of Australia, we will allow them 0.19 milligrams per day. That's divided by 10. That's about 100 millilitres of water, 200 millilitres of water. 1 glass, less than 1 glass. So now you've got the preposterous notion that in order to say 0.6 of one tooth surface, possibly, or in Australia 0.3, possibly, or none, possibly, we are going to risk damaging their mental development, possibly. A child drinking 2 litres of water at 1 part per million would get a higher dose than a child drinking 1 litre of water at 1.9 parts per million. So you actually got to control for 2 things here from that result in China. You've got to assume, number 1, the range of sensitivity, and you've also got to consider the range of doses that your children are getting. Can we assume that those children, those 300 children in China, had exactly the same range of exposure, the same amount of water? Does 300 children take into account all the water is drunk? What's the big difference here? Big difference is here, you're very hot. It's a very hot climate. So some kids are probably, especially athletes, are probably drinking a lot more water than those kids in China. 2 more human studies have come out. With one that's newly published by Ding and others, and they found lowering of IQ at even lower levels than Zhang. And another study from Mexico, which we weren't aware of, but my son just found, where they found an association between visual spatial learning and fluoride exposure. So there were a difference in the ability of a child to learn certain visual spatial patterns and things. That's 2009. Now let's switch to the thyroid function. The NRC again, several lines of information indicate the effect of fluoride exposure on thyroid function. Now, if fluoride actually lowers thyroid function, it could explain 1, the delayed eruption of teeth, 2, lowered IQ in children, because that's a function of the thyroid, and 3, increase in hypothyroidism among the US population, plus the symptoms that go with hypothyroid: depression, lethargy, tiredness not relieved by sleep, obesity. These things are escalating like gangbusters in the United States. And what's more worrying for Australia is that you are known to have a lot of people with outright iodine deficiency or borderline iodine deficiency, and under those circumstances, fluoride makes the situation worse. There was one study from China which showed fluoride levels at 0.9 made the IQ lower for people that were already borderline iodine. And that's not being taken into account in Australia. Bone. There was a study done in Mexico which showed a relationship between the severity of dental fluorosis, that's no dental fluorosis, 1, very mild, moderate, and severe, the relationship between dental fluorosis and the incidence of bone fractures in both children and adults in a high natural level community. People have criticized the methodology, but there's been no attempt to reproduce this study in any fluoridated country in the world. Arthritis. The first symptoms of fluoride's damage to the bone are identical to arthritis. Stiffness of the joints. Fluoride attacks the collagen, the connective tissue. Stiffness in the joints. Pains in the joints. Pains in the bone. This is what millions of people in Australia, millions of people in America have this condition of arthritis. And yet, 1 in 3, and yet no fluoridated country is collecting fluoride bone levels in a systematic fashion to check a possible connection with arthritis or other bone problems. And in Australia, even though the National Health and Medical Research Council, this tame little puppy in Canberra that's supposed to look at this issue every so often, they recommended in 1991 that Australian health authorities did exactly that. You should be collecting fluoride bone levels so that you have some decent data to see if there's any relationship with bone problems. We don't think there will be. You should collect the data. Never have in 19 years. 20 years now. Our big concern here is that fluoride, as it continues to accumulate in the bones, about 50% of the fluoride that you take in each day from every source, from your beer, from your Coca-Cola, from your water, from your dental products, from your pesticide residues, accumulates in your bones over a lifetime. And it makes the bones, to begin with, harder. It increases bone mineral density, but eventually it makes the bones more brittle. And that's the bone that we're concerned about, that hip, that hip joint between the hip and the pelvis. When that breaks, it's very serious for adults, for seniors. For seniors, when that breaks, 50% never regain an independent existence, and 25% are dead within a year. So if fluoride is contributing to the breakage of that bone, it would be very significant. And again, would you risk that for your elderly, for your women? You've got that to look forward to. And by the way, I've just come from Perth, from Western Australia, where I met an executive of a mining operation. He told me that some of those miners are drinking between 10 and 12 litres of water a day. That means they're putting between 10 and 12 milligrams of fluoride into their bodies each day, which means that about 5 to 6 milligrams of fluoride are going into their bones every day that they work, and those men have no idea that they're probably wrecking their bones in their future. No one's warning them about that. And incidentally, 10 milligrams per day is the upper limit for protecting the bone, according to our Institute of Medicine. And I have problems with that figure. I think that's far too high. I think it should be closer to 5 milligrams per day. So these guys are really in trouble. And you've got miners up the road here, mining uranium. Silly thing to do. We don't need nuclear power, thank you very much, nor nuclear weapons. But anyway, you can make a lot of money out of it. Now, this was a hip fracture study done in China by American researchers, and it's covered in this book, and it's also covered in our book. So I'm not going to talk about it very much. All I'm going to say is that they looked at hip fractures in the elderly as a function of the level of fluoride in the water of 6 villages. And they found that once you went above 1 part per million, the hip fracture rates doubled. And then by the time you get to 4.3 parts per million, the hip fractures had tripled. But you'll notice, you see the asterisk there? Is that village 6, which is the only statistically significant figure. But then you have to ask yourself, it looks like between 1 and 4.3, there's an increase. There looks like a trend there. Is it a trend? In which case we have to be concerned about exposures at 1.5 parts per million, which are doubling hip fractures. And that works out about 6 milligrams per day, doubling of hip fractures. Or is it a threshold? In other words, are those numbers for villages 4 and 5, because they're not statistically significant, not real? There's a difference between something being real and something being statistically significant. So if you're not accepting this as a trend, then what you're accepting is that nothing happens until you get to 4.3 parts per million, and suddenly the hip fracture rates triple, which is the more reasonable. We've argued that the trend is more reasonable, in which case we should be concerned about exposures at about 5 or 6 milligrams per day, or maybe even less, because who knows what's happening between 1 part per million and 1.5 parts per million. And fluoride may cause a bone cancer called osteosarcoma. I'll give you the science, and then you get a whiff of the politics operating here. You probably got a whiff already. In 2001, Dr. Elise Basson, a dentist, successfully defended her PhD thesis at Harvard. A doctoral thesis is actually not called a PhD at Harvard, small point. She found in a matched case control study that if young boys were exposed to fluoridated water in their 6th, 7th, or 8th years, that they had a 5 to 7-fold increase in developing osteosarcoma by the age of 20 compared to non-exposed boys. Now, this study was really important, because she was the first one that had pursued the notion that there was a window of susceptibility, that was a certain age range, which actually corresponds to the mid-childhood bone growth rate, that the child may be more susceptible to it. Now, this is important because other people had looked at these studies and hadn't found this relationship. But they didn't look at the age range. They took the kids at 20 and compared them. And if you took the kids at 20 in this study, you'd find probably no difference in the osteosarcoma rates for the kids who are exposed and non-exposed. It's only when you look at this window of vulnerability. Now the politics. Her boss at Harvard was a guy called Professor Chester Douglas, who was a consultant for Colgate. Does that remind you of somebody? Or a consultant for Colgate, and also a well-known proponent of water fluoridation. And you had to think, why on earth did the National Institute of Health, looking at an issue of such sensitivity, give it to somebody who's promoting fluoridation? I mean, if this result is true, fluoridation is over, right? If fluoride causes cancer, it's finished in the United States. There's no safe level for a carcinogen. Therefore, the level where you allowed in the water would be 0. It's over, it's finished. And what you're saying here is we've got a study here where fluoridation may be killing young men. Oh, right, well, obviously we give it to a dental school then. We give it to a dental school. We give it to a professor who's already stated what a disaster it would be for fluoridation if it was found that fluoride causes cancer. In a paper he published in 1991, he actually said that. It would end fluoridation, he said. And his study then, in 1991, said, whoops, guess what we found? Fluoride is actually protective against cancer. That's what he found in 1991. Anyway, between 2001, when Basson found this, he had three opportunities to tell the public, to tell fellow scientists, and to tell the NRC panel that asked him about his work. He had the opportunity to tell them about what Basson had found, and he kept his mouth closed. To the British Fluoridation Society in England in 2002, he said, my work shows no relationship between fluoridation and osteosarcoma. My work. Doesn't mention his graduate students' work. And to the NRC, he says, my work shows no relationship between fluoridation and osteosarcoma. This time, he puts her thesis as a footnote. but doesn't explain that the footnote actually contradicts what he's saying. For that person who was reading the NRC, for them to understand the significance of that footnote, they would have had to take a plane from Washington, D.C. to Boston, to have gone to Harvard, found the thesis in one of the libraries, and then found out that that thesis contradicted what he was telling them in his memorandum. Well, eventually, Bassin published her research in May of 2006 on cancer causes and control. And Chester Douglas, who up to this point has behaved like a rather lame rabbit as far as speed is concerned, or maybe a slut, suddenly rushed into action. And on the day that her article was published, he publishes a letter. And he says in this letter, you shouldn't rush to judgment on this paper. My work shows that this relationship does not hold that Bassin is talking about. And he then promised his study in the summer of 2006. And we are still waiting. We are still waiting for Chester Godot Douglas to publish this study. But meanwhile, agencies like, guess who? The NHMRC are using this promise by Douglas that his study is going to refute Bassin as if it was a published study. So you look at NHMRC and they're so fussy about what studies will count as far as their review is concerned, and then all of a sudden they are going to be prepared to use a promise of a study which has not been published, which has not been peer-reviewed, to negate the strongest study yet published on this issue. And by the way, that same NHMRC dismissed this report in one sentence. So here they're asked to review the toxicity of fluoride and the fluoridation program. They have this work that took 3 years for 12 scientists to prepare, 507 pages, 1,100 references, and they blow it off in one sentence. They said it was not relevant to Australia. We fluoridate our water 1 part per million, and these people only looked at 4 parts per million. Nonsense. Although they said that 4 parts per million is not safe, they looked at a number of studies where it found effects at less than 4 parts per million. I'm sorry, I probably sound a little angry, a little passionate. I'm only angry and passionate because I know what the science says. And I know that science has been torn up in front of me, it's been torn up in front of you. And it makes me very angry. Because these people are working for us. They're paid for by our taxpayers. Our taxpayers are paying these bureaucrats who work in the health agency in South Australia, Western Australia, Victoria, Queensland, Tasmania. They're working for us, and they're lying through their teeth. They are deceiving the public. It's a massive betrayal of the public's trust. And I mean that. It's a massive betrayal of the public's trust when doctors go on a stage, and dentists go on a stage, and health officials go on a stage and say fluoridation is safe and effective. Number one, if they're a dentist, they have no right to talk about any issue other than the teeth. They're not qualified. And to say that it's safe when they cannot produce a single health study in Australia to demonstrate safety, and a bit bloody difficult from around the world to demonstrate it's safe. And in the meantime, ignore all the red flags that are being waved in India and China is utterly irresponsible. It's a massive lack of due diligence, if nothing else. But it is a religion. So let's give you some idea of the professional competence of the American Dental Association. Lovely people in white coats, but never hurt you. Listen, this is professional advice to dentists. Individual dentists must be convinced that they need not be familiar with scientific reports of laboratory and field investigations on fluoridation to be effective participants in the promotion program, and that non-participation is over neglect of professional responsibility. Give me a break. Can you imagine any other profession saying, you don't have to be on top of your literature, to go out there and promote something as safe and effective, even though it might be killing people, even though it might be damaging their IQ, it might be accumulating in their pineal gland. You don't have to worry about that. And by the way, if you don't do it, you're neglecting your professional responsibility. Well, you'll hear from Andrew in a moment. He can confirm this is the same kind of thing happening in Australia. You're not expected to know anything about this. You're expected to go out like a clockwork toy, put your white coat on, and assure the public that everything's hunky-dory. For over 60 years, the fluoridation debate has been controlled largely by the dental profession. And thank God we have people like Andrew and Hardy Lineback in the United States, John Cahoon in New Zealand, David Kennedy in California. There are dentists with integrity who have come out and risked losing their jobs and being chastised by their peers, who have come out and warned us. But this is how they see us. This is how the dental profession sees us. They see us bloody great mouths, these huge teeth, walking around with legs on, mouths with legs on. And that's what you've got to do. This is a metaphor for what's happening here. The religious protection of teeth. We should put a little patch in there, 0.6. Oh, sorry, Australia, 0.3. Oh, sorry, Australia, 0.12. I was at college with John Cleese and played soccer. This is how fluoridation opponents see us, and that's not very pleasant either. It's a little bit more protective, I think. And no investigation of possible relationship between consumption of fluoridated water, this is Australia now, and lowered IQ in children, arthritic symptoms in adults, hypothyroidism, increased bone fractures in children, earlier onset of puberty, Alzheimer's disease in adults, and nor have studies investigated formally the many anecdotal reports that some individuals are highly sensitive to fluoride. And this is why this report is so important. We have the professional perspectives on fluoridation. We have 15 people in white coats with Nobel Prizes and 3 members of the National Research Council and others, myself, others, dentists and doctors, spoken at the professional perspective. But this is the citizen's perspective here. This is the citizen's perspective from those who, when they're exposed to fluoride, come down with a litany of problems. And they do their own experiments. They remove the source of fluoride, and guess what? The symptoms clear up. And then by accident, they re-exposed to fluoride, and the symptoms come back. And they do this again and again and again. And for them, it's damn good science. But their government has let them down, because their government is not bothering to check out, not bothering to put on a scientific level what thousands of people in Australia are saying, that they are suffering every day from fluoride in their water. They're being neglected. Oh, and guess what? That lovely NHMRC, little agency from Canberra, part of the Australian government, said in 1991, these reports, these anecdotal reports, are so numerous that we urge the health authorities to put this on a scientific level and investigate the issues scientifically. That was 1991. Here we are in 2011, and not one health agency in Australia has attempted to put this on a scientific level. And so they're ignored. These people are ignored. You suffer. That is so irresponsible, again, from your government authorities. So utterly irresponsible. And this videotape absolutely nails this issue. And when you look at these people, you say, the pompous people in their white coats. And they will look at this video and say, those are only citizens. Oh, he's only a naturopath. Oh, he's only this, he's only that, and so on. And I say to those pompous people in your white coats, as long as you do nothing, this is the best science on this issue, right here. This is the best science. And don't complain about it not appearing in peer-reviewed journals. This is the best science. It's based upon observation, human observation. And if you don't like it, go and do the science. But if you're not prepared to do the science, I'm sorry, this is the best science here. have used, you know, if you're an epidemiologist, one of the things about this issue, which is, woo, you know, wonderful, this is instant orgasm if you're an epidemiologist. You see, we have a non-invasive biomarker of fluoride exposure. We know that the amount of fluoride that a child is exposed to before their permanent teeth have erupted is very clearly indicated to us on whether they have no dental fluorosis, very mild, moderate, or severe. The more fluoride that they've been exposed to before their permanent teeth come out, the more severe this condition. So the obvious thing to do is to look at every childhood complaint that you could think of, from autism to neurological effects, to IQ deficits, to bone fractures, to thyroid function, to the levels of melatonin, as a function of the severity of dental fluorosis. Never done it. Never done it. In Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, Ireland, Israel, one study in America, they looked at behavioral problems, but it was only a small study. If you don't look, you don't find. The absence of studies does not mean the absence of harm. Remember that phrase. Please use it. So please, you haven't done the studies in Australia. You haven't done any health studies in Australia. So don't tell me it doesn't cause harm. You're assuming that because you don't do the studies, there's no harm. And I actually witnessed this. This was just like an episode of Monty Python. Believe me, I was there. It's videotaped. Dr. Peter Cooney, the Chief Dental Officer of Connett, told an audience in Dryden, Ontario, in April the 1st, 2007. He says, I walked down your high street today and I didn't see anyone growing horns, and you've been fluoridated for 40 years. So I now have visions of Health Canada with this huge department of horn specialists. Some specialise in cow horns, deer horns, moose horns, and they go around Canada looking to see if anybody's sprouting horns, and then faithfully report back to Health Canada, nobody's growing horns in Canada, therefore the fluoridation program is perfectly safe. Anyway, they would like to pretend that the science is on their side. I urge you to watch or read the professional statement on a webpage, which has been now signed by 3,558 professionals from around the world. I urge, if there's anybody in the room that has a professional qualification, to add their names to it. The 29-minute videotape called Professional Perspectives, Now This Firewater, and our book. We have the solid case there. And I wrote this with my colleagues so that citizens, well, first of all, I tell my wife it's like being constipated for 14 years and someone's allowed me to have a crap. She said, don't say that, don't say that. I think it's, you know. Anyway, I wrote this so that citizens could not be put down anymore. You know, who are you? Who are you? You're not a dentist, you're not a doctor, you're not a water engineer. You say, I'm not, but I've read this book. Have you? Have you read this? Have you read this? Can you tell me why I should ignore what's in this book? What's your answer to this book? Then you've got the upper hand on this fellow. And that's the problem. The biggest crime here, I don't have a problem with dentists. Some of them are quite nice people. But the problem is that we don't read the literature. Neither dentists and doctors are so busy they're not reading the literature. And their crime is simply to regurgitate what they're told by others secondhand and just tell it to the public as if it was gospel. Now, if you don't want to read the book, that will take you a few days. Then try this. Just ask them. You say, well, you know, get a copy from Anne. She's already reproduced a few hundred of these. This is great. Just say, look, I'm not a professional. You're a doctor. You're a dentist. I've looked at this videotape. It's only 28 minutes long. Would you look at this? I'm concerned. Would you look at this and come back and tell me whether I should be concerned or not? You're respecting their professional qualifications, etc. Be very humble.
Please, sir, would you look at this video? Would you spend 28 minutes to see if you might save my